Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight to learn about how stress is sabotaging your dog adoption efforts. I'm Lynn Fridley, Program Manager for Maddie's Institute. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Sheila D'Arpino, Director of Research for Maddie's Fund, where her aim is to develop and support research that increases pet adoptions and improves pet well-being. After graduating, Dr. D'Arpino worked as a general practice, emergency vet, shelter veterinarian at various hospitals and agencies. Then in 2005, she graduated from Maddie's Shelter Medicine program at UC Davis, becoming the first in the nation to complete a 3-year postgraduate behavior specialty training program with an emphasis on shelter animals and shelter behavior programs. Before we start, let's talk about a few housekeeping items. Please take a look at the left side of your screen where you'll see a Q&A window. That's where you'll ask questions during the presentation. We urge you to get those questions in early because Dr. D'Arpino will address them periodically throughout the presentation. If you need help with your connection during the presentation, you can click the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. The green File widget contains the presentation handout and a printable certificate of attendance for people attending this live event. So be sure to download, save, and print. Dr. D'Arpino, thanks for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thanks for having me. I want to welcome everyone here. It's nice to see so many familiar names in our list of attendees and such a great registration for this topic. I'm really excited to be talking about stress and dogs. This is one of the first topics I ever spoke at conferences, and I haven't had the opportunity to talk about it in quite a while. So a huge thanks to Maddie for allowing me to talk about stress. There's going to be 3 sections to this webcast with a short break in between each section, and that short break is going to be for you to ask questions. So if there aren't any questions, we'll move on to the next section, but if there are, we'll take a short break for that. So please be sending in your questions. The other thing I wanted to talk about before I start talking about stress is taking pulse. Periodically throughout this webcast, I'm going to take your pulse, which means there's going to be something that pops up on your screen. If you're watching an on-demand version of this webcast, you're not going to see that pop up. But if you're watching it live here, you're going to see that pop up with a green thumbs up or a red thumbs down. So that's checking in with you, seeing how things are going, and tell me whether you give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So our agenda for today, we're going to talk about stress. I think we all know what that is, and I'm going to take our pulse for the first time. Don't answer yet, but the question I want to ask you all is, are you currently experiencing personal stress at a level that you feel affects your well-being? So go ahead and green check if you think you're under some stress that's affecting your well-being, and a red thumbs down if you're not. All right, we got the answers coming in here. And so right now we have about 60 to 68% of people who've answered, and it's closer to 50-50 in terms of who's feeling stressed to who's not, but it looks like more of us are feeling stress than people who are not feeling stress, which is not surprising. Thanks so much for chiming in on that. So stress is pretty ubiquitous. We don't always think about the role it plays, though, in the behavior and the likelihood of adoption of our shelter pets, and that's why we're all here today. In our first section, we're going to be talking about stress and what it is. In our second section, we're going to be talking about stress again and how shelters and individual pet personalities affect their stress levels. And in the third section, we're going to be talking about stress and welfare. So the first section is just our introduction about what stress is, and we're going to be talking about physiology and things like that. But I'm going to start with a little story. You can see the cute puppy up on screen who looks a bit stressed about being in that cave. That's not who I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about a dog like Virgil, and I know that all of us have stories about dogs and stress. Virgil, at the time I met him, was a friendly, well-adjusted dog with no problems. He was a great, great dog. But he was black, which some people are less likely to be interested in black dogs. Other people love them. And he was also a pit bull type dog in Boston. And in Boston, we have it's challenging for us to find homes for pit bull type dogs, just like it is for many shelters across the country. And so Virgil, despite being a friendly, well-adjusted dog without any problems, and he was about 7 years old, didn't get adopted. And we waited, and we tried to find him a home, and we tried to find him a home, and we waited, but no adopters came through the door. And Virgil began to deteriorate despite walks 3 times a day, play groups, and extra attention because he was a staff favorite. And Virgil ran out of options over time. He was with the shelter for several months, but his quality of life and his behavior, some behavior problems appeared, deteriorated to the point that the shelter was unable to find Virgil a home. And it was a very sad and life-changing experience for a lot of the people who loved Virgil. But it really brings home the idea, and I know we all have our Virgil stories, and that's why we're all here today, but that stress impacts our adoptions. Virgil came in as a healthy, wonderful dog, and he did not leave that way. So it causes deterioration of wonderful dogs like him, who we might be able to save if we are able to recognize and develop preventative strategies early on. Story sad, but it's an important point. And by learning about stress, we can prevent other dogs like Virgil in the future. So you see this picture here and of a Vizsla and a Spaniel. And in looking at this picture, which of these dogs is stressed? Is it the Vizsla? Is it the Spaniel? I think most of us would agree that Spaniel is pretty stressed by that mouth coming at him. I would argue that both of these dogs are stressed. There's something stressing out the Vizsla to make him behave aggressively. I would argue that both of these dogs are stressed and they're both experiencing it. But what really is stress? It's our physical and physiological, which includes emotional response to a threat. So these 2 dogs are certainly experiencing it. It is what mobilizes our body's resources to keep us alive when we're exposed to a significant stressor. And when I say stressor, I'm talking about something that causes stress. Could be another dog, like in this picture for the Spaniel. In this picture, that stress and the Spaniel's response to that stress might be saving that Spaniel from harm by enabling him to move away from that threat. However, if the harm is a fight over a valued resource like food, it might also be what enables that Spaniel to fight back and secure a resource that is necessary for him to live, especially if resources were very scarce. Stress is our fight or flight response. It is what protects us from really bad and scary situations. So there's a very valuable purpose for stress and our stress response, but it can also cause some challenges when things don't work exactly as we would want them to. Physical signs of stress. So you can see a word cloud here, and there are many physical signs of stress, some of which you can see on this slide. You can see decreased appetite. That's a pretty common one. When we think of our own bodies, many of us eat more when we are stressed. That can be true with pets, but decreased appetite is a lot more common. All the items that you see up on the screen there are more common signs of acute onset stress. And there's a classic signs that are things like tense muscles and dilated pupils that we think about related to stress, but it's really important to remember, and we're going to be talking about frequently in this webcast, that stress can manifest as almost anything. And that's a challenge, right? Because if it can manifest as almost anything, how do we know if a dog is stressed? And how do we know if it's the stress that is leading to a behavior change that is versus some other thing that is causing that behavioral issue? We'll be talking about all this today. We're going to be watching 2 videos next, taken at a shelter about 14 years ago. I'm going to have you all watch and then answer a question about whether you feel the dog is stressed, and if so, how stressed is the dog? Here we go. We're looking for things like tense muscles, dilated pupils, trembling, aggression, lack of movement, hiding. It could also be things like panting and pacing. Many different emotions and behavioral responses like fear, aggression, and anxiety are linked and related to stress. All right. So that is our first pit bull type dog that we're going to evaluate and comment and give our opinion about his stress level. And so we're going to go ahead and launch our first poll.
So the first poll is, how stressed was that dog that we just saw? Not stressed at all, slightly stressed, moderately stressed, highly stressed, or you're not sure. Please answer on your screen, not in the Q&A box. And while you're answering on your screen, I'm going to ask you to submit your questions to Dr. D'Arpino. We'll be taking a break in a little while, and she'll be able to answer some of them then. So answer on your screen for this, and in the Q&A box, send your question to Dr. D'Arpino. How stressed was this dog? So let's look at the results. That's interesting,
Great.
Dr. D'Arpino.
Yes, thank you so much, Lynn. Definitely some good results there, in that the majority of people are feeling that that dog was highly stressed, moderately stressed, and no one said he was not at all stressed, and I would certainly agree with that. This dog was displaying signs of fear in terms of approaching and backing away and approaching and backing away, and dilated pupils and tense muscles. And he was certainly demonstrating enough physical signs of stress that would make me put him in the moderately or highly stressed range. I would probably like, I know these questions are difficult to answer, I would like to have a little more information to really classify him, but my vote for him was he was highly stressed. Thanks for your answers there. And so we're going to jump into our next video, which is going to ask you the exact same question at the end. This video is much shorter, and this is Smiley. So we're looking for the same signs here. So that was Smiley. So now we're going to launch our second poll, asking the same questions about Smiley.
And it's the same questions. How stressed is this dog? Not at all stressed, slightly stressed, moderately stressed, highly stressed, or not sure. With that smile on his face, I wouldn't be sure either. That was a really smiley dog. So please answer on your screen. And we'll see how Smiley fared with the results.
All right. Well, Smiley's results are kind of all over the board. I think the highest number of people said that he was not at all stressed or slightly stressed based on our survey respondents. But some people felt he was moderately stressed and some felt that he was highly stressed. These two dogs, you probably noticed the big, gigantic collars around their necks. They were part of a custody case and had been seized from a home where they were had had a lot of trauma in their previous home and were part of a dog fighting situation. I would have put by watching this video Smiley in the range of slightly or not at all stressed. I probably would have put slightly because for me, just the fact of being in a shelter, almost all dogs are going to be a little bit stressed. But who knows, for Smiley, this may be the best life he's ever experienced. Unfortunately, he had that name because part of his lip was removed in a dogfight, and that's why he looked like he was always smiling. And the shelter tried to turn the negative into a positive by giving him a good name around it. The reasons that I feel that Smiley is a lot less stressed than the first dog is, number one, you could see a ball right between his front feet. And most dogs aren't going to play ball when they're stressed. And so that gave me a hint and a guess that he probably wasn't that stressed. Some dogs bite, but most aren't going to do any significant playing while they're stressed. The other thing we could see in that video was that his hind legs were laterally underneath him, meaning they were directed out to the side instead of tucked underneath him. And that is a relaxed and comfortable body posture. And that doesn't mean it's out of the question that a stressed dog could display that posture, but that is a posture that I'm more likely to associate with a dog who isn't super stressed, as long as he's healthy otherwise. He was also panting, and panting can certainly be a sign of stress, but panting can be a sign of other things too. It can be a sign that he's hot because he was just playing fetch for quite a long period of time. So there's a lot of reasons that a dog could be doing different behaviors, but I think most of us are in agreement. And if this is something you want to look at and learn about more in terms of behavior and body language, there's lots of resources out there. The ASPCA and the Center for Shelter Dogs have some great ones about body language and stress. I'm going to do a pulse check here. Does this all make sense to you? If you're a bit confused, give me a thumbs down. If it makes sense, give me a thumbs up. And just a reminder, as we're looking to see how everyone's feeling about what we were talking about so far, submit your questions to the Q&A area if you have them, and we'll discuss them during the first break. And it looks like we are in really good shape here in that I don't see any thumbs down. So that's great news. I hope that continues. All right. So now some of you may have seen this slide come up and say, oh, goodness, this isn't what I wanted to learn about. I think it's important to learn about the underlying mechanisms of stress and why and how they happen, because that helps us to understand why we see some of the side effects that we do in our dogs. And you'll see a lot of humans in these slides. It's because they don't make many dog slides with the same type of pathways, but our stress response is the same. So we've talked briefly about external signs of stress. Now we're going to be talking about our body's internal response. I'm going to try to make this as painless as possible, but it's really important, and that's why I want to share it. So when we are stressed, like that spaniel was with the picture of the Vizsla that you saw, our fight or flight response is activated. And it activates two main systems in our body. The system on the left, you see it saying that big long word, sympathomedullary pathway, or the sympathetic nervous system. And on the right, you see the pituitary is in the brain, and the adrenal, which is right above your kidneys, system. So we have these two main systems that are activated in our body when we're stressed. The sympathetic nervous system mobilizes our body to produce adrenaline and noradrenaline, or also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. And it mobilizes our body to increase our heart rate, increase our respiratory rate, so our breathing is faster, increase our blood pressure, so that we can produce energy and respond to that stressful circumstance and deal with it appropriately. That was the left side of things, the sympathetic nervous system producing adrenaline and noradrenaline. The right side of things, the pituitary adrenal system. The pituitary, a gland in our brain, sends signals down to the adrenal glands and causes the release of cortisol. You can see that blue corticosteroids highlighted there. Corticosteroids and cortisol are the same thing, and these are what many people call our stress hormones. Cortisol mobilizes the body to produce energy, and it moves resources away from other areas of the body, like our immune system, which is a pretty important system. So that's a very quick and dirty summary of how our stress systems work. When we're assessing shelter dog stress, we can look at behavior, but we can also look at these physiological signs. There are lots of other things that can cause stress. There are lots of other things that can cause stress, but there are lots of other things that can cause the physiologic signs of stress. So we just talked about increased heart rate. And that increased heart rate might be due to exposure to something stressful, but it also can be because we're exercising and having fun, and that is why we're experiencing an elevated heart rate. So if we're trying to assess stress in pets and ourselves, we need something that is more specific, that allows us to more specifically identify, is this pet truly stressed? So we can look at lots of different byproducts and factors in the body that we won't be talking about today, but we can look at levels of cortisol in the body. So you can see that pituitary system produces cortisol, and we can look at those levels of the cortisol. We can compare the levels of cortisol to the levels of another substance in the body called creatinine. Creatinine is a byproduct of muscle metabolism, and it's excreted by the kidneys at a regular rate. And we can look at the ratio of cortisol to creatinine in the urine to assess stress. And this cortisol to creatinine ratio, as we call it, is thought to be a highly reliable assessor of stress by most experts. There's not 100% agreement on it. I don't know if there's 100% agreement on anything, but most people agree that's a pretty reliable indicator that a pet is stressed, is looking at elevated cortisol to creatinine ratios. It's really important to note that cortisol to creatinine ratios are not highly correlated with behavior. So you would think that you would see high levels of behavioral signs of stress associated with these high cortisol to creatinine ratios, and that hasn't been found to be true. My opinion on that is that it's likely due to the different behavioral manifestations of stress. So when I'm stressed, I'm oftentimes very quiet, so I'm not like a dog that's jumping all over the place. And because there are so many different behavior signs of stress, that's probably why we can't find a strong relationship, or it's my opinion, I don't have research to back it up, why we can't find a high association between the two. And the bottom line is that things are pretty much impossible to measure on a day-to-day basis, are the most accurate measures. So we can't be going and getting this cortisol to creatinine from the urine on a day-to-day basis with our shelter dogs. So it's a valuable tool when we're doing research, but it's not a valuable tool to help our shelter dogs. So how do we assess stress on a day-to-day basis? My opinion is that we establish a baseline for that pet, and we spend time with them every day, even if it's just observing them from outside the kennel, and look for changes. We look for behavioral indicators. We assume they're stressed when in the shelter, and we'll talk about that soon. So I'm going to do another pulse check here really quickly to see how everybody's doing. We're going to jump forward from this slide as soon as we check in. So is this all making sense to you? Green thumbs up if you're a little bit confused, red thumbs down. All right, and it looks like we are still in great shape. Thank you, everybody, for participating in these pulse checks. I enjoy seeing how everybody's doing, and it looks like we have some people who are a bit confused, and I tried to make this as understandable as possible, but it is a scientific subject. For those of you who have a thumbs down, I do encourage you to type your questions into the chat area to see if we can help you understand it a little better in the Q&A session, or you're welcome to contact me after this is over as well. So this is another slide talking about the physiologic signs of stress. So it's talking about the specifics. You can see them all there in terms of dilated pupils and things like that. And it's important for us to remember that stress causes all of these changes, whether it's as a person in this picture or an animal. These changes happen with exposure to acute stress, and it's something that our bodies and our dogs' bodies experience. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about types of stress, acute stress versus chronic stress versus episodic stress. This is important to talk about because these types of stress have different impacts on our body. So acute or short-term stress can certainly cause emotional stress. It can cause things like headaches in people. Does it cause headaches in our dogs? I don't know if we know how to measure headaches in dogs. I think that's a very interesting concept, and I would love if someday we can know that a dog has a headache, but I don't know how to assess that. Stomach and intestinal issues, all the signs we saw on the previous slide. Whereas when we're talking about episodic acute stress, this is acute short-term stress that happens too frequently. So this is stress that comes and goes, and it's characterized in people by people who worry about things a lot. And it often occurs in people with a type A personality. I don't know if it's more common in certain type of dogs' personalities. I think that would be a great topic for research. Lots of great topics for research. So that we've talked about acute and episodic. Now let's talk about chronic stress. This is the one we're really concerned about. This is long-term, persistent, consistent exposures to stressors, which oftentimes result in behavior changes like aggression, depression, difficulty concentrating, and it's dangerous and unhealthy. What happened to Virgil, what I talked about at the beginning of this lecture, and it's the really, really big thing that really impacts our adoptions if we're not on top of things and managing our population. So next we're going to talk about different types of stress responses. So on the left you can see that our dog was attacked by a dog. That's a stressor. The dog's response up on the top in the green, he may become more cautious or display distance increasing behavior, so doing something to make that dog go away. And most people would call that an adaptive response. So we have adaptive and maladaptive stress responses. But whereas if my dog was attacked by a dog and now he panics and attempts to flee every single time he sees another dog, no matter what that dog is doing, or he attacks another dog every time he sees it, it's likely that this dog is having worsening stress every time he sees other dogs, and this is a maladaptive response. So we want recovery from stress. We want an adaptive response. But oftentimes what we see in highly stressful environments is this maladaptive. What happens when they can't recover? So what happens when we have maladaptive responses or we have situations where there's just stress after stress after stress and it doesn't go away? We'll be talking about this more later, but oftentimes we have a vicious cycle of stress and more behavioral changes, and this really influences our adoptions, and we'll be talking about this more as we go on this evening. And we're going to
we'll take a little break for questions here, Dr. D'Arpino, and we have some good questions in the queue. I'm going to push this first one to the slide area, and we'll go from there. Is there research that supports correlation between an elevated cortisol creatinine ratio at or shortly after intake to the shelter and eventual development of behavior issues?
So there is research that supports elevated cortisol to creatinine ratios at intake into a shelter, and that rates tend to decrease over time. I don't know of research related to cortisol to creatinine ratios and development of behavioral issues. I think that's a great topic, and there might be some research out there, but I don't know of any of it. It's an excellent question. I wish I had the answer.
Here's another one that's related to that. With the CORT-CREAT ratio differentiate between an acute stress and a chronic stress?
So oftentimes, in most situations, that is not going to differentiate between an acute stress and a chronic stress. With chronic stress, sometimes our whole pituitary adrenal axis and our whole stress system can get completely out of whack, and cortisol levels are not what you would expect them to be despite exposure to a very high level of stress. So I would say that acute stress, they're probably more reliably going to be elevated, but I don't know of evidence that we can easily differentiate between acute and chronic with looking at that urine test.
Okay, thank you. Here's the next question. Do you have suggestions on getting a valid baseline on a shelter dog? Dogs can vary and hide symptoms. If we don't know what is normal for an individual, it can be hard to monitor.
Excellent question and comment. My suggestions for getting a valid baseline is, number one, the dogs can hide symptoms, but they also oftentimes want to physically hide when they're stressed. So I recommend giving them a hiding place when they're stressed. It may just be a kennel for them to retreat into. And we can even use that as a tool to assess their progress. So for me, the ideal way to get a baseline would be to take the dog out of its kennel and get it into a room and spend some time with it. But I understand that most of us are not going to have time to do that. And in those types of situations where we're dealing with a very large population, I assess, or a small population but not very much time, I assess by going from kennel to kennel and standing outside the kennel and doing a couple things, just observing their behavior. Are they hiding in their hiding place? Are they coming forward and saying hi? And I also assess whether the dog is interested in taking a treat or taking actually even just a piece of kibble, because stressed dogs are oftentimes not going to eat, as we talked about earlier. And if he doesn't take that piece of dog food, then oftentimes I'll offer a special treat. And I'll continue to observe his behavior and his reactions to environment as well as me. And I do that on a daily basis so that I can see his progress. So I don't know what's normal for him, but I do know what I see on that first day, and I can see how that changes over time. So it's never ideal when we don't have a history, but we can evaluate changes over time, which is very valuable. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, very. So should shelters be measuring cortisol levels of their long-term dog population, or is monitoring behavior enough?
That's a really good question. I think the scientist in me says it would be awesome if we could be measuring cortisol to creatinine ratios in our long-term shelter dogs. But the realist in me says that I would rather direct our resources to spending time with that dog and doing things to attempt to reduce its stress, because most pets that are in a shelter long term are going to be stressed unless they're pets that have a ton of enrichment and social companionship and don't enjoy being around people that much. Most of them that are there long term, even in really, really good environments, are going to be stressed. So I recommend going with behavior.
Thank you. Would it be advisable to take a dog that seems constantly stressed to a vet to determine if it's due to a medical issue? I have a personal dog with Addison's disease, which is treated with medication to control her cortisol levels.
So you're asking a veterinarian whether to take a dog to a vet. Of course, I'm going to say yes. Thank you for suggesting that. Yes, a dog who seems constantly stressed. Actually, my foster dog Finn, who's next to me right now, is one of those dogs who seems constantly stressed, and that dog does need an evaluation because yes, stress certainly can occur, as we'll talk about in the next section, due to and be highly associated with different medical problems, but it can occur because of medical issues. So when we're dealing with stress and we can't figure out a reason for it, and even when we can figure out a reason for it, a physical examination to make sure we're doing everything we can for that dog is very valuable. And I hope your dog with Addison's disease is doing well.
We have a lot of questions, Dr. D'Arpino. We'll take one more and move on and hold the rest for later. Hopefully we can get to them at the end. We will have another break for questions coming up shortly before we get to the end of the presentation. But here is the next and final question for this section. Will stress increase in long-term shelter dogs who have little contact with staff members and the public, as opposed to dogs that spend more time in the presence of staff members, i.e. dogs who are segregated from the main shelter?
Great question. So when we have, when we're talking about stress and shelters and dogs, there's more and more research nowadays, but there's a lot of areas where we don't have research results to back up anecdotal evidence. But this is one of those areas when we talk about physical contact with people where we certainly do have research that tells us that physical contact of people with dogs reduces shelter dog stress. So I don't know whether you're asking about just presence of people and you don't actually have physical contact with them, because that could be more stressful that you see them but can't get with them. But I can tell you that physical contact is very useful for our shelter dogs and certainly reduces their stress. So we want to encourage that whenever we can, especially in a safe way. All right, so we will go ahead and move on to our next section, which is stress, shelters, and personality. So we began by talking about what it is, and now we're going to talk about different factors that affect why we experience it differently. We all likely know that pets and people that can be in a similar circumstance but have drastically different stress levels. So my one foster dog is super stressed and the rest of the dogs in my house aren't. And that's what this section is about. So why are shelter dogs so stressed? This page is full of reasons why shelter dogs are stressed. Things like disruption of routine, diet changes, loud noises. Lack of social contact is a big one for our dogs who tend to be social. But remember that every dog is an individual, and some dogs may not like people. Some dogs may not like other dogs. The other big one, and why it's the number one right at the top of the screen there, is lack of control and choice. So being in an environment where you have no control over what happens to you and no choice over what happens to you is a huge source of stress, and certainly something that most of our shelter dogs experience during their shelter stay unless we are employing enrichment programs. All of these are important, and I could probably list a lot more that aren't on here. And that's why the question is not if a shelter dog is stressed. The question for me is rather, how stressed is it, and does that stress increase or decrease over time? So, for example, a homeless dog with inconsistent food sources before he came to the shelter and other threats, his stress might reduce fairly quickly when he enters a shelter. Whereas a pet dog who was trained every day and got to do agility and was on a good quality diet and had a lot of attention from his family, his stress might increase really quickly in a shelter because he doesn't have any of that in the shelter. So we always look at the dog as an individual and how these environmental factors are affecting them. Our stress response is pretty darn complicated. You can see the top layer on this slide. You can see things like environmental stressors. So for a shelter dog, that can be things like the things you saw on the previous slide. So the noise in the shelter, the barking dogs, and all the factors we talked about in the last slide. Major life events, I'd call being surrendered to a shelter as a major life event for a dog. Trauma and abuse. We don't know about most of our dogs' history, and probably less of them experience trauma and abuse than many people think, but that certainly is a factor. So these are all background factors. We also, if you look on the far left there, you see individual differences. So each one of us, each dog, has individual differences based on their genes, based on their development, and based on their personal experience. And these top-level things, as well as our individual differences, drastically affect how we perceive a stress. So you can see that laying over the brain, perceived stress. Perception is super, super important. Our backgrounds and our personalities strongly influence our perception of things, and I might perceive things as super, super stressful because of my past experiences, whereas everyone else in the world doesn't think that as a stressful item at all. So perception is probably the biggest factor that influences our stress response. Hopefully, our perception of that stress and our behavioral response to the stressor that you see there on the right leads to adaptation and a reduction in stress, but that is not always the case. I'm going to do a quick pulse check here as I jump to the next slide to see how everybody is doing. Is everything still making sense, or is it getting a little muddy here? So thumbs up or thumbs down. And while we're getting the answers there, I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about an adaptive stress response. So in an adaptive stress response, so in this example, our perceived stress and our stressor is a shelter stay in this situation. We might see behavioral responses like attention-seeking behavior and barking that also produces physiologic response in the body, and the stressor produces those physiologic response. And if those things may very well work to reduce our stress, and we recover from that stress. So this is an example of a situation where we have an adaptive response and a recovery. And looking at our pulse check, we're getting more people who are a little bit confused by everything, but still the vast majority of people are in pretty good shape, which is great. I'm going to close out our pulse check here for now, and just remind you to type your questions into the chat area if there are certain specific things you'd like me to talk about in more detail. This is an example of chronic stress and a loss of coping mechanism. So this example is of a long-term shelter stay. We might have some of similar behaviors like attention-seeking behavior, barking, and anxiety, and we might still have our physiologic response, but it also might be different at this point in time because of this exposure to the chronic stress of being in the shelter and other things that are affecting this dog. And this increases our allostatic load. What is allostatic load? It's basically the wear and tear on the dog's body. So it grows over time when the dog is exposed to repeated and chronic stressors, like some dogs are exposed to in shelters. And it can result, as you can see on the bottom right, in stress overload. So we see lots of physiologic and physical consequences there, and this is what we're really trying to avoid. And the next slide here, you see a stress curve. So when you're looking at this curve, stress levels increase as you go to the right, looking at that bottom long arrow or axis. And this is a slide based on people, but we can, like I said earlier, extrapolate most everything to dogs. That's a slide of performance. Performance is probably a little more difficult to evaluate in our dogs. But the purpose of this slide is to highlight the fact that that area on the left, you look on the right, a little bit of stress is normal, and with no stress, we can be inactive and bored, as it says there. But when we're talking about high levels of stress, we can get sick, It leads to maladaptive behaviors, decreased ability to cope with that stress, and disease. This is the area we want to avoid. Stress affects behavior. There's a famous little guy, if you're fans of Star Wars, you know that Yoda says, do or do not. There is no try. And when it comes to stress and behavior for me, I say there is no if, there is only how. And that stress is there, that we've separated them from everything they know and love. Even if it wasn't great, it still was something that they likely had been comfortable with over time. Some dogs who've lived in horrific situations don't feel comfortable in a very enriched environment because change is a stressor. Environmental change is a stressor. So my big question is how much are they stressed and what can we do to help them with it? The next video that we're going to show illustrates the effects of stress on behavior very clearly. Let's watch Benny, a lucky dog who was adopted from Carson Animal Shelter in Gardena, California. How many of you have seen Benny's video? Someone shared it with me a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it was just such a wonderful example of, number one, a happy dog, but number two, of the effects of stress, because we see Benny scared, and stress. And then once he gets out of that kennel, he is jumping for joy and also getting his self out of that area and those barky dogs as quickly as possible. And this dog for me just brings home the point of the effect of stress on adoption so much, because people tend to want a dog that seems to like them, that comes up and says hi. Benny was unable to do that because he was so stressed and scared. Luckily, someone overlooked that and adopted him anyways, or the shelter was smart and introduced him in a way where he wasn't as fearful. And so this is an example where stress did not influence adoption, but Benny was lucky. A lot of other dogs don't have that same benefit and just stay there scared in their back of their kennel and don't receive any help and don't get adopted, which is a huge shame. But Benny is a wonderfully happy story, and I wanted to share the quick change from terrified dog. It was that environment that was causing Benny's stress. He probably has a personality that has a tendency towards fear, but as soon as he was out, he was a different dog. I'm going to quickly talk about stress and disease because the other way that stress really impacts our adoptions is through disease. We're going to revisit cortisol because stress activates our pituitary adrenal system and cortisol, and that weakens our immune system. It makes us more susceptible to many diseases, like are written on the screen. This is really related to people diseases. Our body is unable to fight off disease as well as it normally can when we are stressed due to our weakened immune system, and it makes dogs more susceptible to things like kennel cough, parvo, skin problems, and even things like distemper. We are going to take our next break for, oh, sorry, I forgot we had a poll here.
Yes, we have a poll here about hormone. What hormone has most often been linked to behavioral changes and occurrences of disease? Adrenaline, estrogen, cortisol, cholesterol, endorphins. Please choose a choice here on your screen. What hormone has most often been linked to behavioral changes and occurrence of diseases? And we'll quickly go to our answers here. Cortisol.
Yay.
That takes the ticket.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Lynn. So yes, cortisol, our stress hormone. Adrenaline and epinephrine is one of our stress responders, but cortisol is the correct answer here. Good job.
So we have a break for questions, and we do have some good questions lined up for you. So let's take the first one. Exercise and human contact. Is that good practice?
That's an easy one to answer, yes. So we know human contact is great. We're going to be doing another webcast in the future in a couple months that we're going to be talking about enrichment and things that we can do to reduce stress. The focus here is really what is stress and how it affects us. But exercise can certainly reduce anxiety. It certainly can reduce stress in people, and I know that it can help dogs. So yes, those two things are
Okay. So we have a policy of holding strays for 2 weeks before bringing them into our adoption program. During this hold period, we're not allowed to take the dogs outside for walks, so they receive little exercise and human contact. Is that good practice?
In my opinion, that is not good practice, and that if we are not getting many of the dogs, even though we don't know their backgrounds, many of the dogs who come to us are house trained, and besides the fact that they're not getting people contact, they're not receiving enrichment in many of these situations, they're not able to maintain house training skills. These are things that can potentially make stress levels get higher and higher. And make things very challenging for how we manage our population. So I really, really strongly recommend the development of programs and talking to your shelter leaders about the effect of stress on your population so you can change your policies and provide better welfare for your dogs.
Thank you. Here's another question. What kind of body language and type of speech or talking should we have as humans approaching a stressed dog in its kennel to walk it or let it out, etc.?
So body language and type of speech talking. So body language, every dog is different, so different dogs are going to appreciate different things, but many stressed dogs are oftentimes very scared or ready to start a fight with us. So we want to do everything we can to reduce our appearance of wanting to fight with them. So that is doing things like not approaching them direct on, standing sideways instead of facing them directly, not having direct eye contact, sometimes crouching a little bit so that we're not so high and above them, and speaking gently to them, not speaking super, super loud, not speaking in a squeaky high voice because that can scare stressed dogs, but speaking in a gentle voice, oftentimes a normal tone of voice, because if you speak quietly in many shelters, the dog's not going to hear you.
This is a good question. So it seems even more compelling that behavioral evaluations are far more accurate as to how the dog would be in a less stressful environment like a home. Seems like strong evidence to transfer to a foster home.
Very interesting comment. We do have evidence that the behavior evaluations that we use are not highly accurate. It gives us a picture at a point in time, and that's what most of the people who've developed these evaluations will tell you, that it gives us a snapshot at a point in time so we can know how to best address the concerns that we find. And likely a foster home can potentially be stressful, but in most situations a foster home is going to be a lot less stressful than a shelter environment, and that's why I really strongly encourage foster care, especially when we're talking about long-term stays. I've seen huge differences in dogs where I haven't been able to keep them in my home for a long time, just 2 weeks, but I get them to my house for 2 weeks and it just changes their world, and then we put them back in the shelter and they get adopted. So yes, 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 foster homes.
We'll take one more question in this segment. It looks like we're going to run a little bit over, folks, so I'd like to keep you all on the air because we do still have some good questions that Dr. D'Arpino can address at the end. We're getting close to the end, but we're probably going to run over the hour, so please stay with us. And here's our last question for this segment. Should play with people and or other dogs be utilized to reduce stress? Can it be a measure of reduced stress, particularly in fearful dogs?
Great question, and I don't know of research that supports this. I would love to see research on it, but play is something that is oftentimes, a dog who is playing is not a stressed dog unless he's playing with someone who's causing him stress, I suppose. So play, because it provides social contact, it provides physical exercise, it's a great way, in my opinion, to reduce stress as long as that play is being managed appropriately. And I would love us be able to use it as a measurement of reduced stress. Someone needs to do that research. All right, thank you for these excellent questions, and I'm going to move on as quickly as possible. I apologize for going over, but we've had some excellent questions so far. I'm going to spend this last little bit of time talking about stress and welfare. I hope it's not too stressful to be learning about stress today. I know a lot of these concepts can be very complicated, but they're important to know about. This is our stress brain loop. I have this slide up here because that little box in the lower left corner is really, really important. With chronic stress, we have a decreased ability to pay attention, to perceive and understand things. We have a decrease in short-term memory and learning. So if you're wondering if and how stress can, and especially chronic stress, can affect our shelter dogs, there it is, right there, big, huge factor. Behavior problems are exacerbated by stress. Given what you've learned so far today about effects on behavior, learning, and memory, this slide shouldn't be very surprising, but it's really important to acknowledge. Anecdotally, I've worked with many dogs like Virgil, who I talked about at the beginning, who didn't seem to have any problems when I first met them, but long term, even trying to do everything we could to reduce stress, the stress of being in a shelter and not in a home with a person turned a non-existent or a mild problem that we couldn't even detect into a big one. I can't talk about stress without talking about length of stay, because we have a vicious cycle here, and that the longer we're in the shelter, our quality of life potentially decreases, and that causes our dogs to display unappealing behavior. And it's just this cycle of the more stressed, the more behavioral challenges we have, and that makes us stay in the shelter longer because no one wants to adopt us. And there's a great chapter in the shelter medicine book that you can see there on the bottom about quality of life stress and emotional pain by Dr. Frank McMillan that I encourage you to read. Welfare. What is welfare? One definition is the balance of positive and negative experiences. We want to maximize positive experience for our shelter dogs while minimizing the negative. We want to maximize positive affective states and minimize negative affective states. I hope you're not sitting there saying, whoa, affective states, what the heck are you talking about? When I'm talking about affect, I'm talking about the experiencing of emotions and feelings, which our dogs certainly experience. And when I'm talking about a positive state, it's the extent to which we experience positive moods. And when we talk about negative affective states, it's the extent to which we experience negative emotions, such as anger, fear, and nervousness. It's really important to remember that the absence of negative experiences isn't equivalent to good welfare, because we need to be having some of those positive experiences to be bringing us happiness and joy. And I don't think we know how to measure happiness in dogs, but I know that dogs experience happiness, and those positive experiences are super, super important, because if all we have is nothing negative, we don't have much of a life. What about evaluating a population of dogs? So on an individual basis, I recommend comparing today's behavior to previous behavior. How is that changing over time? But on a population basis, it can be really valuable to evaluate the entire population of dogs who are in your care. So we can use a welfare assessment protocol, like you can see here on the screen. This is one that is being developed and validated and has a very nice protocol that you can use to evaluate your shelter dogs. You can get the aid of a professional group like the University of Florida or UC Davis or Humane Network to evaluate the welfare of your dogs. But you want to be looking at things like housing. What conditions are they housed in? This is pictures a situation where the dogs might look happy, but they're pretty overcrowded. These dogs are just thrown in together without concern for behavior, and there's a lot of stress in this shelter. We can look at disease levels, cleanliness, enrichment, what type of enrichment is being provided. We can look at things like, do dogs go on walks every day? Great form of enrichment for dogs and can drastically improve their welfare because it gives them sensory enrichment in terms of all the sensations and smells that they're experiencing outdoors, physical enrichment in terms of exercise, mental enrichment in terms of all that brain power they're using, sniffing the ground and engaging their brain, not the grain. And it gives them a small degree of control. If we allow them to choose a little bit where they're looking around and where they sniff, that gives them a little bit of control over the life, which can be a really powerful thing for them. I love dog walking programs for shelters. So is experiencing stress worthwhile? This is the big question, right? Is it worthwhile if it results in saving a life? And this is really important. And my answer is yes. If we're actively doing something to help and actively working to improve their welfare and circumstances, I think experiencing some stress is worthwhile if it results in saving a life. But if that stress is resulting in problems that then decrease the likelihood of adoption, like we've talked about so much through this lecture, then we need to take drastic action, because in this situation, the circumstances and the housing and the situation that we're providing are likely resulting in that dog's death. And in my opinion, that's just not fair to the dog. So what can we do to help? We'll be talking about this more in a webcast in a few months, and there are lots of webcasts out there on enrichment and stress reduction that I encourage you to watch. You can see some of the options here, and I look forward to seeing some of you in the webcast. I believe it's 2 months ago to talk more about this. But at this point in time, I think I'm going to end it here, and we're going to take some more questions.
Yes, and we have some good ones lined up for you, Dr. D'Arpino. So here's our next question. Are there meds that can be used to reduce stress?
Yes, there are medications that can be used to reduce stress. Things like lavender can have a calming lavender oil, so not necessarily a medication, but lavender oil, the scent, can have a calming influence on dogs. Medications, there are behavioral medications that can be prescribed by veterinarians that can be used to reduce stress. Trazodone is one of my favorite medications for shelter dog stress because it tends to help to reduce their stress without a lot of side effects. But there are a number of different things that we can try. I do very strongly recommend going the route of enrichment and foster homes and everything we can do otherwise if and when we can. But if all that is failing and we still have high level of stress, addressing that stress is crucial to me, and those are situations where I feel it's our duty to use medication because we're acknowledging that the environment isn't ideal and we're doing our best to help our dogs.
Thank you. So somebody's asking about fostering, but can't fostering a dog and then returning it to the shelter also increase stress?
Really good question. Someone just emailed me about this topic earlier today, and it almost makes me wonder if the question is from her. I don't know the answer to that. That is an excellent question because some people are very concerned that it can. My opinion is that getting them out of the shelter for even one day can be such a positive experience for them that I feel that it's worth it, but it's also really going to vary from dog to dog and personality to personality because it's the stress of then going back again going to be so horrible that it's just going to make them give up and be really depressed. I don't know, but I do know that I have anecdotally, I've seen many situations where fostering gets the dog adopted, and that's great, or fostering allows them to start feeling like a normal dog again, and so that they then get adopted, but a great topic for research.
Thank you. What can be done for long-term residents that develop spinning behavior in their kennels even though they're getting walked?
So this is a topic we could spend hours talking about, but a big thing that you need in this situation, in my opinion, is environmental change. So I've had situations where dogs that have been in that situation and spinning for a long time in the same environment get transferred to a different shelter, and that shelter is doing similar things to what happened at the previous shelter, but just being in a completely new environment can change things up for the dog, and that spinning behavior can go away. It's important to remember that that spinning behavior is oftentimes a coping mechanism so it's how that dog deals with his stress, but it's not going to get him adopted in most cases. So environmental change can be a huge factor. Getting them into foster home can certainly sometimes help in this situation. In some situations, nothing works. In some situations, medication works. So you just have to try different things and not give up.
Maybe this will work. Can soft classical music help reduce stress in a shelter?
There certainly is research that was done a while ago now that demonstrated that soft classical music can reduce stress I shouldn't have said can reduce stress, can result in calm behavior in shelter dogs. So do I know that that reduces stress? I can't say that with certainty, but we can probably equate calm behavior with reduced stress. So yes, that is a good thing to try, but remember that change is important, because if you're playing the same music over and over, the dogs get habituated to it and don't listen to it anymore. So soft classical music is good, but you also want to change it up and change think of the right word, change the person who made that music so that you're getting different experiences.
So here's something that's interesting. When I was in vet school, the teaching dogs did a lot of spinning. I put a DAP plug-in in the kennel area, and they literally stopped spinning overnight.
Wow, that is really exciting. And I haven't had as good experiences with DAP as you have. I haven't had negative experiences with it, but I haven't had a lot of situations where it's helped. But maybe I haven't tried using it enough, because that is very exciting news. For those of you who don't know, DAP is dog appeasing pheromone. It's something that you can put on a dog via a collar or a plug-in into the wall, similar to Feel Away in cats, that is supposed to help to reduce dog stress. Certainly something to try.
Can using thunder shirts in the shelter be a good way to reduce stress?
So thunder shirts, the idea behind a thunder shirt is that it wraps the dog very securely, and that security helps the dog to feel comforted, and reduce their stress. We did a short pilot project with this when I was at the Center for Shelter Dogs, and we didn't find a significant effect using the thunder shirts versus not, but it is one of those things like DAP that it doesn't hurt to try. But once again, remembering that if you have the thunder shirt on the dog all the time, he's probably not going to get habituated. He probably is going to become habituated to it, and it's not going to be effective anymore.
Does one badly stressed dog affect the other dogs who seem less stressed and trigger more stress in them?
Really good question. I can only answer this anecdotally. I can tell you that when I'm making videos for lectures or things like that, and I play a stressed dog barking when I'm making that video, all of my dogs get up and look at me in a very concerned way. And if I play a video of a happy dog barking, they ignore it. So dogs do speak to each other via barking, and if that stressed dog is barking like they oftentimes do, yes, he can certainly affect the other dogs. He can also affect the other dogs in many different ways, depending on how he has contact with. But even not having contact with them, there can be odors that they can sense that could potentially make the other dogs more stressed. And it's my opinion that that was one of the things that was causing stress in Benny, the dog that we watched earlier, was all those other stressed dogs were making him really stressed. Could be wrong, though.
We have a long-term shelter dog that's very fearful of people, especially strangers. The managers have decided to limit him to certain staff members. So he is only being socialized by the same two people every so often. Is this hurting him more?
So when we are working with fearful dogs, oftentimes when we begin working with them, I do recommend working with just a small number of people so that that dog becomes comfortable with a limited number of people, because exposing that dog to lots of people when he's very fearful is very overwhelming. So initially a small number of people is great, but if you're trying to really help that dog, you want to gradually be exposing him to more people over time. So that means, if necessary, educating staff about dog body language and how to behave and help a scared dog so that the dog can gradually become comfortable with more and more people. So over time, is it hurting him more? I don't know if it's hurting him more. I'd say it's definitely hurting him just the same, because my feeling is that if we're not doing something every single day thinking, what can I do to help get this dog adopted? What can I do to change things, that we are hurting him and potentially putting him in a downward spiral so that he gets more and more stressed. It's really scary when you have a fearful dog and you're worried about them behaving aggressively, to to expose them to more people. And that's why education programs for our staff and volunteers are so important.
How about office fosters for dogs that can't be placed in foster homes? The staff bring a dog into the quiet area of his or her office for a few hours a day.
That's a great idea, and that's something that we often did when I worked at the Animal Rescue League of Boston. I had a shelter dog in my office almost every single day, and I loved it. And that gets the dogs out of the kennels, and it gives them time to relax. There certainly is evidence that shows that one of the best things for shelter dogs might be just time to relax, and not necessarily active running type enrichment, but just time to be quiet and calm and relax. When you're stressed, we all need that, right? Some people like a lot of exercise, and it's really good for us, but having that quiet time is invaluable. So office fostering is great if you have the office space, and sometimes it even means just keeping them behind a counter with you, just giving them a little time.
So where can you get a DAP plug-in?
You can get a DAP plug-in at most pet stores. It's sold under a variety of different names, but basically you're looking for the pheromone plug-in for dogs, and so it's not going to be called DAP. In the past it was called Comfort Zone. I can't remember. I haven't used it in a little while, so I can't remember whether it's still called that, but go to your local pet store and you can find them there. You can also certainly find them online. Look for pheromone plug-ins. The pheromone is what is in the DAP that helps to reduce stress.
Okay, so we're going to take one more question, and then we'll end for the evening. Any questions that Dr. D'Arpino haven't answered, we'll get up on our website in a Q&A format. So here's the last question. What are your thoughts on the trend of group housing for dogs in large playrooms, similar to a doggy daycare setting?
My thoughts about that are it depends. So I do like the idea, but I have some cautions about it in that putting many dogs together without thought for behavior can make a couple dogs really happy and a lot of other dogs really unhappy because stress levels can be really high if we're not managing these dogs and matching the groups so that similar types of dogs who actually enjoy being together are actually put together. And we also want to make sure they're all getting some downtime, and so they're not going to, most dogs don't want to play all day long, so do they have relaxation time and downtime where they're not allowed to play. But I do like the idea in general. I think there are a lot of potential benefits as long as it is very carefully and cautiously managed related to dog personality as well as safety in terms of avoiding dog fights.
Excellent. Thank you. I want to remind the audience that we do have other resources on our website. One of those is a learning track, which has many different components, and it's on enrichment and stress reduction for dogs. Just go to maddiesfun.org. So that's the end of our event. We want to thank Dr. D'Arpino and all of you for your time tonight. We invite you to take a few minutes to complete our survey. Your feedback is important to us. Click on the link on your screen. If for some reason you don't see the link, it's also in the resource file. The link will also be emailed to you in a few days. This webcast will be available on demand shortly, and we hope you will share this presentation with your colleagues and on your social sites. Please take advantage of our free on-demand webcast available on our website at maddiesinstitute.org and plan to join us and Dr. D'Arpino on February 4th for a second installment in this series, How Stress is Sabotaging Your Cat Adoption Efforts. Attendees will learn the role of stress and welfare on health, disease, and well-being in cats in shelters and rescue groups. We look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for being here with us this evening, and good night.